Outside, the hotel's sign gleamed in the sunlight. The very hotel I had built from the ground up, brick by brick, before he even knew our family's name. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his coffee, looking around the lobby like a man admiring his own property. He didn't notice how I studied him, how I weighed every word he said against the years of sweat, late nights, and sacrifices that had made this place possible. He didn't know, or maybe he chose not to know, that every single beam in this hotel had passed through my hands. Long before his voice ever echoed in these halls, before he wore a suit and called the staff by name as if he had earned that right, this place had been nothing but an empty patch of land and a dream I could barely afford to have. I remember the first time I stood here, boots sinking into the soft dirt, staring at a future that looked impossible. There was no sign, no lobby, no guests. Just me, a set of sketches on a weathered table, and the faith that one day people from all over would walk through these doors and feel welcome. The walls that now carried the warmth of golden lamps had once been open frames against the wind, held up by my aching arms and the stubbornness that refused to let the project die. I'd worked through winters so cold my hands cracked and bled on the wood, through summers so hot the tools burned my palms. Every inch of plaster, every tile in the hallway, every polished step on the staircase had a story. And all those stories had my name on them, even if no plaque on the wall would ever admit it. I remembered the nights I slept here, not in a luxury suite, but on the bare floor of what is now room 206, listening to the creaks and groans of new beams settling into place, like the building itself was learning to breathe. I remembered the days I chased down late deliveries, the arguments with suppliers, the quiet victories when something finally fit exactly as it was meant to. This hotel wasn't just my business. It was my proof that hard work could turn an empty field into a home for strangers who would never know the fight it took to give them comfort. And now here he was, walking these same halls with the ease of someone born into it, never once stopping to think that the ground beneath his feet had been fought for, paid for, built with hands that had nothing left to give, but still gave anyway. He might have thought I was just a guest here, but these walls, they knew better. They had heard my hammer before they ever heard his voice. They had seen my shadow working late into the night, long before they saw his reflection in the polished glass. This place was my history written in wood and stone, and no smirk, no careless words could erase it. I kept my tone civil, my eyes calm, as if his words had been nothing more than idle conversation. I even managed a small nod, the kind that says, "I've heard you, and that's enough." But inside something shifted, not in the way a branch bends under the wind, ready to spring back, more like a hairline crack in stone, small but irreversible. His sentence had carved into me in a way that didn't bleed on the surface, but bled deep in the quiet places, the ones you don't show anyone. So I sat there, sipping my coffee, letting the room breathe around me. The clink of cups, the soft hum of the air conditioner, the distant sound of someone dragging a suitcase across the marble floor, all of it wrapped around me like a strange reminder of why I had built this place in the first place. It wasn't for applause or for titles. It was to create something that would stand long after the people in it had forgotten who put it there. But forgetting doesn't make the truth disappear. And while I nodded and let him think I agreed, my mind was already stepping away from the table. I was retreating into the quiet, where plans take shape without the noise of confrontation. This wasn't the time to correct him or remind him of the truth. No, I would let him live inside his illusion a little longer. I would let him think the crown fit perfectly, that the weight on his head was light and easy. And in the stillness of my own thoughts, I began to wonder what it might look like when I finally let him hold that crown for real, when he'd discover that the gold was only paint, and underneath was steel, heavy enough to bow his head. I began watching him more closely, not in the way one studies an enemy, but the way a craftsman studies the weather. Quietly, patiently, knowing that storms announce themselves in small signs long before the first drop falls. I noticed how he moved through the lobby, his pace slow but deliberate, as though the marble had been laid just for his feet. His eyes scanned the room the way a collector surveys a gallery, not with gratitude, but with possession. Every nod he gave to a guest seemed rehearsed, every smile stretched just enough to appear genuine, but never reaching his eyes. The staff reacted to him differently than they did to me. With me, their greetings were easy, natural, born from years of shared late nights during holiday rushes, from the memory of me rolling up my sleeves to carry luggage when the bellboy was sick. With him there was a stiffness, a faint pause before they answered his questions. They bowed their heads out of duty, not respect. But he didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. In his mind, a nod was a nod, whether it was given with warmth or with caution. I saw how he lingered at the front desk, fingers drumming on the polished wood as if testing its worth, speaking to the receptionist in the slow, clipped tone of someone who believes the uniform in front of them is less than the suit they wear. He made suggestions as though they were orders called improvements, what were really cosmetic changes. A new vase here, a different color for the menus there, never understanding that the soul of a place is not in the decorations, but in the hands that keep it alive. Sometimes I'd stand at the far end of the lobby, half hidden in the curve of the staircase, and just watch. I'd watch the way he leaned against the counter during check-in, inserting himself into conversations that didn't need him, as if proximity to authority made him the source of it. I'd watch the way he eyed the guests who dressed well, speaking to them longer than he did to the families in travel-worn clothes. I'd watch the way he carried himself like a man who had been given a crown without ever having fought for a kingdom. And as I watched, something in me hardened, not out of spite, but out of certainty. Certainty that he did not yet understand what it truly meant to own something. That real ownership is not in the keys you hold, but in the nights you've stayed long after everyone else has gone, fixing what broke because you couldn't bear to let someone wake to disappointment. He wore ownership like a coat in spring, light, casual, ready to take off when it became inconvenient. I said nothing. I simply kept watching, knowing that sooner or later the weight of the truth would settle on him. And when it did, it would not be because I had told him, but because the walls themselves would whisper it in the silence, in a language only those who have built with their own hands can truly understand. I searched their faces, not for defense, I no longer expected that, but for some trace of conflict, some sign that my absence from the circle of belonging weighed on them. What I found was worse than indifference. It was comfort. Comfort in letting someone else carry the insult, in watching it pass over without consequence, in choosing the easy stillness of pretending it hadn't happened at all. The silence at that table was not neutral. It was complicit. It told me everything I needed to know about the kind of loyalty that lived here. Loyalty measured in convenience, offered when it cost nothing, withheld when it might cause the slightest discomfort. And in that moment, I understood something I hadn't wanted to see. I was not just a guest in the hotel. I was becoming a guest in my own family. Memories flickered in my mind, like the warm light from the chandelier above us. Dim, fragile, almost nostalgic, if not for the bitterness creeping in. Birthdays where I worked 2 extra shifts to afford her first bicycle. Evenings I stayed up to help her finish her school projects, my hands covered in glue and paper scraps. Nights when she was sick and I sat by her bed whispering stories so she wouldn't be afraid of the dark. All of it seemed to dissolve under the weight of her refusal to meet my eyes now, so I stayed quiet. Not because I was defeated, but because I was learning. I was learning who could be trusted, who valued comfort over courage, who would let the truth slip into the cracks of the floor if it meant they didn't have to bend down and pick it up. And as the meal went on, I began to understand that this silence, theirs and mine, was not an end. It was the beginning of something else entirely, something deliberate, something that, when the time came, would speak louder than any protest I could make now. After hours, when the last guest had gone to bed and the lobby lights had been dimmed to that soft golden glow, I would retreat to the ledger room, my sanctuary, my witness. The air in there always carried a faint scent of old paper and furniture polish, a smell that to me was more honest than any perfume of fresh flowers in the lobby. I would pull the heavy door shut behind me, turning the brass key in the lock, sealing myself away from the world outside. Here, no one interrupted, no one questioned my place. Here, I was not just a guest. I was the keeper of the truth. Receipts fluttered between the pages, thin, brittle paper that carried the weight of hard choices. They weren't just numbers. They were nights I'd stayed up worrying about payroll, mornings I'd woken before sunrise to meet a supplier halfway across town, afternoons I'd patched a leaky roof myself because I couldn't afford to hire it out. Every figure was a sacrifice, every signature a vow that this place would not fall apart on my watch. Sometimes I would pause, my pen hovering over the day's balance sheet, and listen to the quiet. The kind of quiet that's not empty but full of the echoes of footsteps long gone, the muffled laughter from weddings held in the ballroom, the whispered gratitude of travelers who'd found warmth here on cold nights. That quiet reminded me that what I had built wasn't just a business. It was a refuge, a promise to strangers I would never meet again, a proof that something made with care could endure. My foot stayed pressed to the brake, the car idling low and uneven beneath me. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles blanched, every tendon straining. Heat shot up my arms, settling like a weight in my chest. The bread beside me might as well have been a stone. I couldn't move. All I could hear was that laughter, quick, sharp, and entirely sure of itself. It didn't falter, didn't waver, didn't pause to consider that the person in the car might feel it like a blade. And as I turned another page, I began to realize that the ledgers weren't just proof of the past. They were keys to the future, keys he didn't know existed, hidden in plain sight, ready to be placed in his hand when the time was right, not as a gift, but as a lesson written in numbers and nights, waiting for him to learn the weight of them. It came one afternoon, slipped into conversation, as if it were nothing more than a casual suggestion. We were sitting in the lounge, sunlight pouring through the tall windows, the hum of guests in the distance. He leaned back, crossing his legs the way a man does when he believes the floor belongs to him, and began to speak about his vision for the hotel. A few modern touches, he said, a bit of streamlining. And then, as if offering me a favor I had been waiting my whole life to receive, he suggested he could help manage things. The words landed softly, but beneath them was the solid thud of his real meaning. He thought this was his moment, the opening where he could step in, take control, leave his mark. He had no idea that the mark he would leave would not be on the hotel, but on himself. He didn't see the trap hidden in the gift. I kept my face still, my voice even, as he spoke. I nodded when he expected me to nod, asked a question here and there so he'd believe I was considering his offer seriously. Inside, I felt the slow, quiet shift of gears I'd been keeping in reserve. All those nights in the ledger room, all those silent meals where I let the insult rest between us, all those hours watching him strut and pose. They had been preparation. This was the door I'd been waiting for, opening exactly when it needed to. He described how we could split responsibilities, how he would take over the business side so I could enjoy my time without the stress. I let him think he was selling me freedom. What he was really doing was selling himself into a life he wasn't ready for. A life where every unpaid bill would have his name on it, where every broken pipe would leak into his sleep, where every unhappy guest would stand at the desk demanding answers from him. I could almost see the weight in my mind, the invoices stacked on his desk, the calls from suppliers chasing payments, the complaints about heating in the middle of the night. He thought management was about shaking hands and giving orders. He'd learned soon enough it was about carrying burdens invisible to anyone who hadn't lived them. I called my lawyer the very next morning. My voice was steady, almost casual, but inside there was a precision I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't anger that drove me. Anger is messy, it clouds the mind. This was something cleaner, sharper. His words, "You're just a guest here," had cut away any hesitation I might have had. Now there was only focus. The documents we drafted didn't shout. They didn't threaten. They were quiet, meticulous, unassuming on the surface. But each clause, each carefully chosen word, was a stone laid in a foundation he would one day feel pressing under his feet. It was all there. The transfer of operational control, the assumption of financial obligations, the acceptance of all existing contracts and debts. There was no trickery, only truth, laid bare in black ink, waiting for the moment he'd realize what it meant. I insisted on one thing above all. The language must be airtight. No loose ends, no room for misinterpretation. I wanted the terms to look generous, almost benevolent. It had to feel like a gift, because a gift accepted freely carries a weight no one can later claim was forced upon them. He would sign, smiling, believing he had been given exactly what he wanted. And he would be right, in a way. But he would also be inheriting the storms that came with it, the sleepless nights, the never-ending decisions that keep a place like this alive. In the evenings, back in the ledger room, I would read over the drafts again and again, not looking for mistakes, but savoring the inevitability of it all. The irony was not lost on me. The very phrase he had used to push me aside was now the compass guiding my hand. He had wanted me to feel like an outsider. Soon, he would discover that stepping into my place was not a position of leisure, but of burden. Every time I initialed a page, I imagined the moment his pen would do the same. I pictured his signature curling across the bottom line, sealing his fate in a flourish he thought was triumph. And I knew that when that moment came, I wouldn't need to gloat. The paper itself would speak for me, in the quiet, relentless language of responsibility. He arrived that afternoon, brimming with the kind of confidence only someone untouched by real struggle can carry. His suit was crisp, the knot in his tie perfectly centered, his shoes polished so sharply they caught the light with each step. He walked into the meeting room like a man stepping onto a stage, already imagining the applause. I was seated at the far end of the mahogany table, the chandelier above us casting a warm, even glow across its polished surface. That table had seen decades of decisions, some born of desperation, some of vision, and it seemed almost aware of the weight about to be placed upon it. I let him talk first. He spoke quickly, outlining his ideas for efficiency and growth, tossing around phrases he must have pulled from business books and online articles. He spoke of branding, modernization, and profit margins, each word bouncing off the polished wood between us and falling flat. I listened without interrupting, my hands folded neatly in front of me, my face calm. When he finally paused, I reached for the folder. My movements were slow, deliberate, the way one might handle something fragile but inevitable. I slid it across the table, the smooth edge whispering against the surface, stopping just in front of him. "Everything we discussed," I said, my voice steady, almost kind. He reached for it instantly, like a man offered a treasure chest without first checking the lock. As he opened it, the crisp shuffle of papers filled the room. His eyes moved quickly at first, scanning the titles and headings, and I could see his posture change, straighter, more alert, as the reality of what lay before him began to form. There it was. Not a conversation about percentages, but the clear, binding transfer of operational control. Every clause, every line laid out with precision, naming him as the sole bearer of responsibility. To anyone else, it might have looked like a gift. To me, it was a mirror, one that would soon show him who he truly was, when the applause faded and the work began. He leaned forward, scanning the signature as if it were the final stamp on his imagined victory. I could see the flicker of confusion in his eyes, a small, wavering shadow, quickly replaced by something brighter, hungrier, excitement, that greedy kind of excitement that blooms when a man believes he has been handed more than he deserves, when he's certain the game has tilted in his favor. To him, my steady hand was surrender. He thought I was letting go because I had nothing left to hold on to. He didn't see the truth in the weight of the pen, the way I had pressed just enough for the ink to sink deep into the fibers of the page, a permanence that would not fade with time or weather. He saw opportunity, I saw inevitability. The room was so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the chandelier's bulbs above us. I slid the signed page toward him, the paper gliding over the polished wood, and sat back in my chair. He picked it up like a man lifting a crown, turning it in his hands, already picturing how it would look resting on his head. His smile was small at first, then grew, stretching across his face in a way that told me he was no longer thinking about negotiations or shared control. In his mind, the hotel was already his kingdom, the staff his subjects, the lobby his throne room. For me, there was no triumph in that moment, no rush of revenge, only a deep, measured calm, the kind you feel when the last brick is laid and the structure you've been building, silently, patiently, finally stands complete. My part was done. His was just beginning. I had seen that smile before, on men who mistook luck for skill, inheritance for achievement. It was a smile that didn't know the weight of what it was claiming. It didn't know about the cold, heavy mornings when the boiler refused to work, or the nights when a single broken pipe could flood a hallway and ruin an entire week's profit. It didn't know about the staff member in tears because her paycheck was late, or the way you learned to juggle bills like a street performer just to keep the lights on. That smile belonged to someone who thought ownership was champagne and ribbon cuttings, not unpaid invoices and the taste of cold coffee at 3 a.m. He leaned back in his chair, that self-satisfied grin settling in like he had already conquered something. To him, my signature was a white flag. He thought I was bowing out, handing him the crown with both hands. He couldn't see that the crown I was offering was made of lead, shaped and polished to look like gold. I let him sit there in his victory, because I wanted him to enjoy it. I wanted him to remember this exact feeling, this rush of imagined power, so that later, when the phone calls came at midnight, when the bills began to outpace the bookings, when the first guest threatened legal action over something trivial but costly, he would think back to this moment and understand. He would remember the weightless confidence he had felt and compare it to the heaviness settling in his chest. And he would finally know that what he had taken was not a throne, but a burden disguised as one. I had lived with those burdens for decades. I knew their texture, their timing, the way they arrived in clusters like unwelcome storms. I knew that payroll was not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but a living promise to the people who kept the lights on and the guests happy. I knew the way certain months dragged profit into the red, no matter how perfectly you ran things, and how one broken air conditioner during peak season could erase half a year's earnings. He knew none of this, and the contract didn't need to explain it in bold letters. It was written in the fine print, buried in the legal language that only reveals its sharp edges when the bills arrive. To him, full operational control was an open field. To me, it was a field already seeded with storms. It would start slowly, almost invisibly. A supplier calling to say prices had gone up, a sudden repair in the kitchen, a guest demanding compensation for something beyond our control. At first, he would see these as small annoyances, but then they would stack, pressing down on him until the nights became sleepless and the mornings began with the same knot in his stomach I had carried for years. I remembered my own first months in that chair, the way optimism curdled into urgency, the way I had to learn that this place didn't run on charm or big ideas, but on endless, often invisible labor. I had paid my dues in sweat, in sacrifice, in missed holidays and personal savings drained to keep a promise. Now, without even realizing it, he had agreed to pay his. And perhaps the most perfect part of it all was that he would think he had taken this from me, that he had claimed it through his own cleverness. Pride would keep him from admitting the truth, even when the weight began to crush him. That's how these things work. You carry the load longer than you should, because to set it down is to admit you were never as strong as you believed. I sat there watching him, the pages still in his hands, and thought about how quiet justice can be. Sometimes it doesn't roar. Sometimes it sits in legal ink, patient and precise, waiting for the day when the crown slips and the true weight makes itself known. Within weeks, the first cracks began to show. Hairline at first, almost invisible, unless you knew where to look. I knew exactly where to look. The confidence in his stride through the lobby had softened, his greetings to guests growing shorter. his smile not quite reaching his eyes. The bills had started arriving, not in neat, polite envelopes, but in thick, bulging stacks. Repairs that couldn't be postponed, invoices from suppliers who had been patient with me out of respect, but saw no reason to extend the same courtesy to him. I would pass him sometimes in the hallway and see it, that subtle tightness in his jaw, the faint crease between his brows. He'd try to cover it, try to summon the same swagger he had in those early days, but it was slipping. The weight was settling in, slow and steady, the way winter frost creeps into the soil long before the surface knows it's frozen. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The building itself was doing the work. Every squeak in the elevator, every knock from the old plumbing, every gust of cold air that found its way under the doors, they were all reminders that ownership is not a crown, but a yoke, and he had placed it on his own shoulders with that confident smile, never realizing how heavy it would be. I came back one evening, unannounced, stepping through the revolving door into a lobby that felt strangely hollow. The air was still, as if the building itself had exhaled and forgotten to breathe back in. The grand chandelier glowed faintly above, but the light seemed dimmer somehow, shadows gathering in the corners. I could hear the hum of the heating system and the faint clink of cutlery from the nearly empty dining room, the usual buzz of conversation, the rolling of luggage across marble, the laughter from the bar. All of it was missing. For a moment he didn't notice me. He was staring down at a stack of forms, lips pressed tight. The kind of expression you wear when you're trying to figure out how to make something impossible happen before the next sunrise. When he finally looked up, there was no smirk, no spark of superiority, just a flicker of recognition. And maybe, buried deep enough that he'd never say it aloud, something like relief to see me. "This place," he muttered, almost to himself, "is harder than it looks." His voice was quieter than I'd ever heard it, stripped of the performance he used to put on for anyone within earshot. It wasn't an apology, but it was the closest thing he'd ever given me. In that moment, I saw him as something other than an opponent. I saw him as a man discovering, perhaps for the first time, that ownership is less about power and more about endurance. And while I had given him the hotel on paper, what I had really given him was the truth, the kind you can't learn from books or speeches, only from the long, heavy days that shape you in silence. Months later, the day came when I knew it was time to step away completely. There was no ceremony, no gathering of family or staff, no grand announcement to mark the occasion. The hotel was busy again, not in the effortless golden way it had once been, but in the frantic, breathless way that comes when too many fires need putting out at once. I walked through the lobby slowly, taking in every detail, the way the afternoon light caught the edges of the marble floor, the faint scent of coffee drifting from the cafe, the echo of footsteps on the stairs. All of it was mine in the way a person can truly claim something they've built with their own hands, not because of a deed or a title, but because their fingerprints are woven into its very structure. I set it on the desk between us. The metal made a soft sound against the wood, but in my mind it echoed like a closing door. He glanced at it, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not pride, not relief, but recognition. He understood, at least now, what that key really meant. Not freedom, not power, weight. I didn't say anything about the past. I didn't remind him of the day he told me I was just a guest here. I didn't need to. The truth had already worked its way into him day by day, until it no longer needed my voice to be heard. I turned and walked toward the door, my steps slow, deliberate, my hand brushing the brass rail one last time. As I stepped outside, the cool air met my face, and I realized something. I was no longer the owner, but I had never been just a guest. My claim to this place was written not in ink, but in the beams I had lifted, the floors I had laid, the nights I had guarded it when no one else was there. And now the weight of that legacy was his to bear. Justice had not come in a courtroom or in the sharp edge of an argument. It had come quietly, in the simple passing of a key, a burden he had once mistaken for a crown, now resting fully in his hands. Even walking from the car to the door felt different now. My steps weren't hurried, my eyes didn't search for the safety of looking down. I moved with the kind of ease that comes from knowing you don't need anyone's permission to exist where you are. And though I never waved first, I didn't avoid their greetings either. If they offered a nod, I returned it. If they said good evening, I answered in kind. But we all understood the subtext, that nothing in their tone could erase the moment they learned exactly whose ground this was.